Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to this latest talk in this term's RGS Northern Ireland programme. Tonight we're going to hear from two researchers at Queen's University Belfast who are completing a project on mapping the casualties of the Second World War Blitz in the city of Belfast. This, of course, marks the 80th anniversary of the 1941 Blitz in Northern Ireland. So with the history of the troubles in post-war Northern Ireland, it's often forgotten in public discourse that Belfast and other parts of NI endured a significant bombardment during the Second World War, when it was, of course, an important industrial base for the UK. So Conor Graham and Dr. Heather Montgomery, who have joined me for this brief introduction, will be explaining their pioneering work with the NI War Memorial Museum in reconstructing the impact of the Belfast Blitz using archival research and GIS mapping. So Conor and Heather, before we get started, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, and how you became involved in this fascinating project? Conor, do you want to go first?
Oh, thanks, Oliver. Yeah, and thanks for getting the opportunity to present our work. So my name is Conor Graham. I work within the Centre for Geographical Information Systems and Geomatics in the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's. So I'm a lifelong geographer and also very interested in geographical information science and technology. And we use basically our mapping and GIS skills to analyze and interpret lots of different types of data, but in particular, this was a very interesting project because sort of independently, I had approached the War Memorial Museum to have a look at a copy of a Belfast target map that they had in their archive that I had seen a few years ago as a digital copy. And I wanted to work with them to maybe make that more public because it's a really interesting map, and I didn't know anything about it myself, as you just mentioned. I didn't learn about the Blitz at school. And I saw an opportunity maybe to tell a bit of history that I wasn't 100% aware of. But the map actually then led to something that was a lot more interesting, and that is this casualty database that the War Memorial Museum and Alan Freeburn there has been collecting. And I realized as a geographer that there were a lot of addresses in that database, nearly 1,000 people. And that gave me the idea that all these addresses where the people were killed could be mapped. And with the power of GIS, we can do that. And then ultimately, we're looking at different types of data, different types of contemporary mapping, just to explore and maybe tell the story in a slightly different way. So thanks again for allowing us to show this information and this project.
Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Dr. Heather Montgomery. I've been employed in Queen's from around 2012 over various projects. And during the past sort of 8 years, I've been responsible for the management of a range of successful military archaeology projects because I'm by nature of my profession, I'm an archaeologist, focusing primarily on military archaeology. I undertook my PhD and it was titled Training Kitchener's New Army, 1914-18, from an archaeological perspective, the training of the Irish experience. I examined and considered the nature of the training in Ireland through the evaluation of the relic landscapes using historical maps and digital landscapes, working with Conor, who was of great help at that particular time, using historical records, cartographic sources, and airborne laser scan data. That enabled me to sort of recognise the surviving camp remains and sort of do, through map regression, the understanding of how these camps, etc., developed, and then thereby the nature of the training that was allegedly never occurred. I've also directed numerous excavations and worked as a lead researcher on a very well studied project with Campbell College, in collaboration also with the Centre for Digital Data Analysis, Living Legacies. I worked as historic landscape project officer for them. But how I've ended up with working with Conor on this project was Conor very kindly asked me if I would be interested in it from my military interest, but also because of what I previously worked with Conor before. mapping landscapes and identifying various features and locations within the historic landscape. And my primary role on this here at the start was geocoding, which we, as I will explain through this here, did not work out straightforward and ended up sort of individually geocoding 1,000 people. So it did. So, but it's been a privilege, and it's also been very enlightening. It's been funny. It's been frustrating. I've been educated. I've been definitely educated in the ways and wherefores of using GIS now that I hadn't this information in the past. I've sort of stumbled through. It's been a learning curve, but it's been absolutely brilliant. And thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share it with us.
Okay, no worries. You're very welcome. And right, well, without any further ado, let's listen to the presentation, and we'll see you afterwards. Okay.
Hi, thank you for coming along to listen to our presentation on our project that we've been working on this year called Mapping the Blitz, Mapping the Belfast Blitz. My name is Conor Graham from the Centre of Geographical Information Systems and Geomatics at Queen's University, Belfast, and I will be co-presenting this presentation with my colleague Dr. Heather Montgomery, Centre for Community Archaeology at Queen's University, Belfast. We'd like to thank Queen's University Belfast and the Northern Ireland War Memorial for funding this research and ultimately the web resource that we're going to publish very soon. And also I'd like to thank the Royal Geographical Society for allowing us to present our work, and hopefully you will find it interesting and exciting to see what we can do with modern mapping, modern spatial data and geographical information systems technology. So thank you. So just before I cover the main elements of our Mapping the Belfast Blitz project, I just want to do a quick overview of what a geographical information system actually is, or a GIS as it's known. So basically a GIS is a software technique based on geographical information science and geographical information techniques to model the real world in a virtual environment. So by modeling the real world, we use spatial data layers, and these spatial data layers can be stacked up almost identical to how we might actually find different types of information layers or different types of layers in the real world. So for example, we would have maybe a geology layer at the bottom, we could have land use layer above that, we could have elevation data or temperature data above that, we might have buildings and roads layered above our geology, we may have historic or modern maps from Ordnance Survey mapping agencies above that, and then at the very top we could maybe have records of the locations of where people live or individual samples of some sort of scientific survey. So in essence what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a digital representation of the real world. So spatial data basically is data that contains coordinates. So those coordinates can be X and Y basic coordinates based on a grid system, for example Irish grid or British grid, or they can be at their base latitude and longitude international coordinates. So we can basically map and represent a location or an area or a feature in its digital format on a digital map, and we can use the X and Y coordinates or the latitude and long coordinates to actually map those features and represent them in our GIS. As well as spatial data, we can also have attribute data. Attribute data is the non-spatial element, which is very important in GIS and sort of sets it aside from other types of mapping software. And the non-spatial data can be records that are attached to the spatial data. So that could be numbers or values of something that is found at that location. For example, the numbers of people, the numbers of a record, maybe the temperature at that location, the height at that location, or another feature. So that's our attribute data. And the two together allow us to generate representations of that data in our GIS database, and we can visualize those locations. So very powerful part of GIS is that we can use the overlapping layers of different types of data and different types of information, and we can use those layers and their spatial relationship to look for patterns between those different layers. So we can use geographical information tools. This is called geoprocessing, and we can use these geoprocessing elements and geoprocessing systems to actually look for patterns that may have been difficult to see just by looking at the individual data themselves. The majority of GIS is software based, so it'll be a piece of dedicated software that's installed on a computer, or we can now host our GIS database and our GIS mapping, and we can also run our analysis or geoprocessing on the internet, and we can use cloud-based resources. In the last couple of years, GIS has also been made available on smart devices, and this is really useful for collecting data. So we can actually use our smart devices, our tablets with our GPS enabled and our internet connections to actually survey data in the field, record, for example, soil samples or population surveys, and we can upload in real time those coordinates back to our GIS, and individuals then can see that data coming in from the field. So GIS is an ecosystem of managing spatial and non-spatial data and looking for patterns within that data. And we're using these techniques ultimately to generate a web GIS where all the data that we're covering in this presentation will be made available to the public, and individuals can search and look at the relationship between historic maps, contemporary aerial photography, and the Northern Ireland War Memorial casualty database that we have been generating X and Y coordinates for from the original database. So back to mapping the Belfast Blitz project, we ultimately need our first piece of spatial data and spatial layer that we're going to add to our Blitz GIS project. And this is the inspiration for the project. This is the Strad Plan van Belfast, street map of Belfast, otherwise known as the Belfast Blitz target map. And this map was created by the Luftwaffe as part of their target packages and their target map packages for the Blitzkrieg of the UK during the Battle of Britain, and the Blitzkrieg of other urban and city centres throughout Europe during the Second World War. The Strad Plan van Belfast, this original copy, there were many copies, but this original copy held by the Northern Ireland War Memorial Museum was discovered by service personnel from Northern Ireland in 1945-1946, after the Second World War, at a Berlin aerodrome. And my understanding is that the service personnel noticed that it was a map of Belfast, and like myself would have been very interested, folded the map up, took the map back home with them, and it was in private ownership, held privately for a number of years before it was donated to the Northern Ireland War Memorial. This is a photograph, a high resolution photograph of the map that is in the collection, of the paper map that's in the collection, and it is the primary source and the starting point for our project, because when I first saw this map as a digital copy that the Ordnance Survey had a copy of, I was very interested in the map as a cartographic historical document of the city that I live in, but also I had an idea that it will be a fantastic opportunity possibly to bring this map into a GIS and either work with it in a desktop environment, but ultimately I wanted to publish it online as a web map so that people, members of the public, could interrogate it and relate it to modern aerial photography and have a look at how this map and the target information based and added to the map relates to modern Belfast. But since that, and after discussions with the Northern Ireland War Memorial, the project grew a wee bit bigger because we now have access to other database information, including the casualty database that we're also going to map within the project, which Heather will cover later. So this map is really interesting. It is actually a composite map created from contemporary Ordnance Survey mapping. So by composite, I mean that it is a number of sheets that have been basically edge to edge combined together, and the Luftwaffe cartographers then have added some extra information to aid navigation and to aid bombardiers as they approach the target city, in this case Belfast. So how do we know it's a composite map? In that it's actually a map that's made up of other map sources. So if we look closely at the map and we compare it with contemporary Ordnance Survey maps of the same period leading up to the Blitz event and also leading up to the Second World War, we can see that it is actually identical to maps that were published in the pre-war years by the Ordnance Survey of Northern Ireland. In fact, the target map is made up of 7 individual sheets that were published by the Ordnance Survey between 1920 and 1937, spanning editions 5 to 6 of the County Sheet series, or the CS series as it's commonly known here. These sheets were published at 1 inch to 1 mile, so it takes 7 sheets approximately to cover the area that the Luftwaffe created in their target map. So when we compare the Luftwaffe target map with contemporary Ordnance Survey mapping, we can see that the cartography is identical. So we see the same types of fonts used in the street names, we see the same representation of buildings and civil structures, we see the same streetscapes and street layouts, and we see the same representations of open areas and infrastructure and water features. So we can be definitive that the actual target map is based on copies of the Ordnance Survey mapping. This is quite interesting in that the county series maps are based on county boundaries. So for example, in Belfast, the county boundary is along the Lagan River. So everywhere to the west of the Lagan is County Antrim, everything to the east is County Down, and the actual sheet would have been cut at the county boundary. So if you look at the sheet map from the Ordnance Survey in and around the City Hall, there is no more information on that map when we head across the Lagan River. So the next sheet map to the east would have had to be manually added by the Luftwaffe cartographers along that boundary, along that county boundary. When we look closely, we can actually see evidence of where the Luftwaffe cartographers have tried to hide some of the seam lines and some of the artifacts that were preserved or would have occurred when joining the maps together. So here we have the Queen's Bridge, which spans 2 Ordnance Survey sheet maps along the Lagan county boundary, but you can see here that the bridge is actually continuous. So Luftwaffe cartographers have actually added the bridge, extended it across the seams, and they have added their bridge representation here in the black lines. So this was quite a difficult process, considering there were 7 sheets with 7 edges, but it shows the care that was taken by the cartographers and the amount of work that actually went into creating one individual map that could be used by crews and used by personnel, as opposed to having multiple copies and multiple sheets spanning the same area if they were to just use copies of the Ordnance Survey mapping at the time. And these hiding, these accentuation and improvement of the seam lines can be found all over the map when we look at it in its entirety. And it may be an area that people might find interesting when we publish the map online, is that we can actually go and see, can you discover any other seam lines where cartographers have physically amended or physically added a feature on the map to improve the representation and to improve their cartography that otherwise would have been an artifact from the original merging of the 7 sheets. So what else did they do with the maps, the composites, the individual maps once they had composited them together? So obviously this is not an Ordnance Survey map anymore. This is a target map for bombing a city. So we need to put in areas that will help us navigate from the air when we approach this city. So the actual black and white map that would have been published by the Ordnance Survey, the sheets that would have been published by the Ordnance Survey and that have been joined together, have been overprinted by the Luftwaffe cartographers to include some colour. So the main colours at the moment that were added to the map were the main roads, the main arterial routes in and out of Belfast in yellow. So here we have sections of the Antrim Road and the North Foreshore Road, now replaced by the M2 motorway, or replaced beside the M2 motorway. They also added areas of open area, so parks, open areas, amenity sites, football pitches, cricket pitches. You can see here were actually coloured in green. Water bodies were also coloured, overprinted onto the composite map. In this case, we can see to the west the Belfast waterworks, which were targeted and hit during the Belfast Blitz, during some of the raids in 1941. And also we can see the water, obviously seawater, that infilled the harbour and the docks area within the harbour estate, especially in and around areas where Harland and Wolff, which were the largest shipbuilders in the UK at the time, were also shown within the map. And within the actual map itself, as well as these physical features to aid aerial navigation and to aid the sort of understanding of what you may be looking at when you're coming in over the city in a squadron to bomb. They also very, very expertly and very, very detailed added representations of primary targets and targets of interest and areas of interest onto the map. So for example, there were detailed what were called single object features added to the map, and a single object was a number and a symbol that represented, for example, maybe a civil building, for example City Hall or Parliament buildings, or important infrastructure within the harbour or textile areas of Belfast. So these individual symbols would have aided in terms of the target to be selected when bombing, the types of targets that bombardiers would be expected to encounter over Belfast, and also they would have included some information, and they did include some information on those targets in the reference and the symbology and the legend of them of this target map, which I will show in a second. Also within the map they created areas, they basically drew areas of strategic and industrial importance. So the areas of red that you can see in this image are strategic areas, so these will be industrial and military complexes within Belfast, and also the purple areas, which would be more infrastructure and industrial. So here, for example, we can see the shipbuilding yards of Belfast that have been shown in the purple outline, and also the waterworks on the Antrim Road in North Belfast. A close-up here of North Belfast, which shows the now removed and closed Victoria Barracks in the Dock Ward of North Belfast, very close to basically the Shore Road, York Street, and the harbour area of Belfast. So a very dense urban area, lots of terraced houses is what you're seeing here. And then within this area we can see, if you look closely, we can see here in Victoria Barracks, which was basically a military army barracks, we can see a symbol, hand-inked symbol representation of a helmet, and this represents a military installation. Also to the east of this map we can see triangles with boxes around them, or within boxes, and these are representations of warehouses and storage areas, and also railway terminals, sidings where infrastructure, or sorry, equipment or materials were stored, and these were given a unique symbol that is in the legend of the map. Also, if you look closely, just below the terminus here of the an old railway station, the old York railway station, you can actually see what looks like, I joke, a baseball cap. What actually you're looking at there is a symbol for a fireman's helmet, or a firefighter's helmet. So not only were infrastructure and military symbology added to the map, but we also see civil defence and civil infrastructure added to the map. In some cases we have symbologies for hospitals, for academic institutions, for firefighting, and even for post offices. So some of those civil infrastructure were also important in terms of targeting and having information on those structures. And I can see closely here, there is a, just to the north in this map, if you see very closely, or if you can actually see it, there is a trumpet representing a post office based on this map as well. So I'm calling this custom symbology that was added to the target map. So the symbology then is explained like any modern map printed in a legend. So here we have on the left, we have our unique objects that were given a number on the map, and also you can see here we have some in German, some information of the single objects that were marked on the map. And we have a mix here of infrastructure, for example, Harland and Wolff, which were building aircraft, bombers. We have Harland and Wolff, who were building ships, and we have Shorts and Harland, or Shorts, who were building aircraft at the time. And we can also see number 1, we have the parliamentary buildings, or Stormont was also marked in the map. And then outside these object areas we have the symbology that was used. So here we can see, for example, symbologies for post offices, for hospitals, for firefighting buildings, for fire brigade stations, and also we have a breakdown in purple of the type of infrastructure that are found within Belfast. So we have motorworks, textiles, etc., chemical industry. So a lot of intelligence basically overprinted onto this map, which is in its own right very interesting. What I find really interesting about the actual target maps and target maps of their time is that they are public mapping that has been repurposed for conflict. So these were maps that were basically published by the Ordnance Survey for benign and civil development and civil infrastructure, and an understanding of the city for benign and peaceful uses. And obviously once the map is published, we don't necessarily know how it's going to be used by adversaries, and in this case the mapping has been used by the Nazi forces and the Luftwaffe to actually create conflict maps that would have been used for targeting and for invasion purposes. And it's very difficult to not look at this map and its sort of history without thinking of the destruction and the death that it actually brought to Belfast and many other towns within the UK and across Europe in the requisitioning of public mapping for military applications. And this is still an issue today, where we see Google Maps, for example, being used in conflicts to help adversaries to map and plan attacks on both military and civil populations. So it's not something that is confined to the realms of history, but is something that is uniquely modern as well. So how do we get an historic paper map into a modern GIS? So we use a technique called georeferencing. Georeferencing is an image processing technique that takes a scan or a high resolution photograph of a map or an aerial photograph, and we process it so that we can actually layer it within the GIS at its correct location. So what we do is that we actually match points from a target location to the source location on the map that we want to georeference. These points are called control points, and they're normally features within another map that has already been georeferenced or has been specifically designed to be used in a GIS. Or we can apply GPS coordinates from a field survey that we can then apply to the historic map if that location still exists. Those ground control points, whether they're real world from a survey or from another target source inside the GIS, can be, for example, the corner of a building, it could be a road intersection, it could be a field boundary, or it could even be a coastal feature that we can use for a control point. And we basically apply enough of these control points across our map that we want to georeference, and eventually we can move and shift and warp and rubber sheet that digital copy of the non-georeferenced map to where it would exist if we were to put it in the real world. So we don't just guess how well it fits, we use some statistical analysis of how well the map that we're bringing in fits the real world coordinates that we're using as control points, and these statistical results give us some metrics called residuals, and these are basically how well the new map location matches the real world coordinates that we're trying to fit it to. And the holy grail when doing georeferencing is that we want our residuals to be as small as possible. So the smaller the residuals, which are normally in map units, are, the more confidence we have that the georeference map, when compared to other maps and even satellite photography, for example, or other coordinates that we may have surveyed in the field, are the same. Our residuals will tell us that with some confidence that the map has been placed in its correct geographical location. So this is not a precise science. It comes with some inherent errors. How well the map was scanned, what condition the historic map was in before it was scanned. Is there a lot of imperfections in the paper? Has it been folded or creased or damaged? Has there been any scale applied to it when we took the image? Sometimes that can happen, but we have special scanners that will try and scan the image without any scaling of the pixels in that image. And also how good we are with our ground control, with our control points. And you can see here from this screenshot of the target map being georeferenced within the GIS is that you can see the actual control points being applied across the map. So once it's georeferenced, we can have a quick look at the quality of the georeference within the GIS. So here I am comparing the target map with the contemporary Ordnance Survey mapping at the time, and you can see that the map is fitting really well. And because we can also bring in modern aerial photography, we can now, with the power of GIS, we can overlay the 80-year-old Luftwaffe map with modern contemporary aerial photography within Belfast. And we can compare not only the historic map with the modern landscape, but we can also record and denote those target areas and how they represent to modern Belfast. Here, for example, is Belfast City Hall represented, and now we have it from our aerial photograph and back to the Luftwaffe target map. So here our georeferencing has been very good, because the original source was Ordnance Survey mapping, and we can apply that to other historic mappings and look at change and how this map now as a layer within our GIS relates to other data sets. We can also do this with historical aerial photography. So the exact same process of georeferencing and finding control points within the historic aerial photography with control points on the ground that exist now or exist in modern aerial photography, we can use that to georeference historic aerial photography within our GIS. And this has particular importance to this project because we have some RAF aerial sorties that were flown 10 years after the Blitz event, and we can actually use this to look at the effect of the Blitz on the urban fabric of Belfast. So here we can see a close-up of the aerial photography from the 1951 RAF sortie over Belfast, and within the GIS it's been georeferenced, and now we can fade and overlap between the modern aerial photography and the aerial photography that was flown in 1951. And if you look closely on the aerial photography, we can still actually see the areas of terrace buildings and the areas of Belfast that were blitzed, and these are areas that were cleared after the Blitz events but remained as derelict sites for at least 10 years after the event. So not only was the population in Belfast reminded about the Blitz through the loss of neighbours and family to the events, but even 10 years after, and if not longer after the event, they were able to see the physical scars and the physical manifestation of the Blitz on the urban fabric, in that large swathes of public housing, terraced housing and factories and civil infrastructure still had to be repaired and still were damaged basically 10 years, an entire decade after the event. This will be made available to do in the web GIS that we're developing for this project. And finally, but Heather will cover this in much greater detail, we are able to geocode and georeference the actual fatalities and the deaths that occurred during the Blitz and represent geographically where those deaths occurred and related to the other layers in our database. So these, for example, here are individual records with their attribute data, so the name, the address of the fatality, where they were buried and their age, and each individual record is shown in its geographical context of where the fatality occurred, whether it was individual or here within clusters, and gives us a representation of the loss occurred that during the Blitz events of 1941. And up until we started this project, these individual records were held in a static database, and the ultimate goal of this part of the project and in mapping and generating our data and using GIS to do this is to, for the first time, record the location of each of these individuals, of each location of loss during the 1941 Blitz in Belfast, and allow members of the public to search via name, search via location, and have a record and a physical visualization and a physical record on a map of where that person was lost. So that's me finished. I'm going to hand over now to Heather, and thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this section of the work interesting, and I'm happy to take any questions later on. Thank you very much.
Hi folks, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak. My name is Dr. Heather Montgomery. I primarily work for the Centre for Community Archaeology at Queen's University, but I have been working with Conor full time on this Mapping the Blitz project, and this is a great opportunity for us to begin to share our research and how the project has evolved, and the process by which we have gotten to where we are now, I suppose, really. So the objective, at least my objective, was to essentially map the location of each Blitz casualty with the view to us creating an interactive web map and integrating that data into a parallel story map. I was to use the Northern Ireland War Memorials Casualty Database, which was compiled by Alan Freeburn, and effectively geocode nearly 1,000 address locations for each of the casualties that he had researched and listed. The data received from the Northern Ireland War Memorial included, as you can see here, individual ID numbers, which we had advised Alan to add to the table, as well as the name, age, an occupation, if we knew that, and a rank if they were a service person, their date of death, and their burial location if that was known, as it wasn't in all circumstances. And in nearly all cases, we were given an address at which the people were killed or fatally injured at. But what we didn't have were XY coordinates for each of these individual addresses, which was unfortunate at the time, really. So for those that may not be familiar with the process of geocoding, put simply, this is the process of transforming a description of a location, such as a pair of coordinates, an address, or a name of a place, to a location on the Earth's surface. And although you can geocode by providing one location description at a time, in instances where there is a large amount of data, such as this, we would tend to convert the entire data set, i.e. this table that you see here, to sort of spatial data XY coordinates, and then use these to automatically geocode within the GIS locate tool. So most projects come with their challenges, and of course this was no exception. It wasn't possible in this case to locate using XY data, as I only had the address at which the casualties were known to have been killed. And so by using the GIS locate tool, that I'm just highlighting here for you, and typing in the address just here, I began to run into problems with the system throwing me back what I would refer to as false positives. So, for example, as we're looking at here, I was looking for Barber Street here in this case, and so I typed in Barber Street up here into the locate tool, only to be given 3 options, and of course none of these were correct, hence my lovely big red X there. So how I know it wasn't correct was because, well, obviously it was in the wrong location across the city. It was actually on the other side of the city, so it was, and it was coming back as Barber Gardens, and I was looking for Barber Street. So I was, and it certainly wasn't beside the police station or in the area of the old mill, as we see here. But more apparently, Barber Street here, which is was located off the Shore Road in North Belfast. So what I had to do then was to set about manually searching for each of these individual addresses, which as you can imagine, was no easy task. In fact, I actually think it took a couple of days to finally pinpoint the exact location of Barber Street. And the same could also be said for numerous other locations across Belfast. So what happened? Well, Barber Street was never rebuilt after the Belfast Blitz, and the area was heavily impacted on by infrastructure development, most notably the growth of the M2 motorway in the late 60s, around 1966, I think. And as such, like many other streets in Belfast, Barber Street was effectively lost from the Northern Ireland Street Directory. And what I was doing then was actually attempting to identify streets and locations across the city that simply no longer existed, the majority having either been destroyed during the Blitz or had long since been consumed by development. So that was one of the major issues we had, or I had. And accurately identifying the place of death for each of these casualties was integral to this element of the project. And it was so important that we could actually geocode each of these 987 individuals named on the casualty list, because these individuals are the story. And for the first time, we were attempting to represent the faces of the Blitz and the human loss of this event within a geographical context. So without being able to geocode, well, we weren't really going to achieve our goal of the project. So not being able to locate automatically, I primarily used the Ordnance Survey NI data, mostly the 1 to 25 first edition historic map dating 1954 to 79, as this offered me the most accurate view of the city post 1941 and served as a good base map, I suppose you could say. I also heavily relied on the Ordnance Survey's 6-inch county series map editions, primarily editions 4 and 5. However, internet searching was, of course, essential. Looking for mentions of old streets was a regular occurrence, as well as scouring relevant literature, including Barton's book, The Blitz, Belfast in the War Years, and Blake's book, Northern Ireland in the Second World War. In addition, I was able to use the georeferenced Luftwaffe target map, which is what we see here, and Conor's already explained quite a bit about this map, it's been vital and I suppose basically the inspiration really for this element of the project. And the RAF sortie images, which you can just see an overlay of them here on the OSNI map below. These proved invaluable for landscape comparison, as did the current ortho images of the city, and especially when compared against the historic data. A resource I also found to be invaluable was that of the 1952 architectural thesis, which was provided to us by the Northern Ireland War Memorial again. A pretty raw undergrad project that had been, I suppose, never really seen the light of day, to be honest with you. It was researched by a former Queen's architectural student, Norman K. Maxwell. And I found this of great assistance whenever, firstly, tracking down locations within the city, but also when it came to understanding the extent of the blitzed areas and matching that up with the other historic data and the cartographic information that we had. Maxwell's thesis was called Rebuilding a City, the Utilisation of Blitzed Sites in Belfast. His work essentially highlighted the extent of the damage caused during the Belfast Blitz and the protracted redevelopment of the city in its aftermath. So using a 1950s Burroughs pointer map, a scale of 4 inch to a mile, Maxwell visualised the bomb sites within the city and their subsequent utilisation within a post-war planning context. He was able to show the areas in which the destruction took place, highlighting that the bomb sites were generally to be found in the east, central and northwest sections of the city, and that the areas affected included the shipyards, the commercial centre of the city, and the industrial northwest of the city. You can just see here, that's obviously the front page of his thesis, and this here's the cover of the actual Burroughs pointer map from the time, where he has annotated it at the front and sort of put, you know, his colour code as to what this one in particular was used for. And that was for the actual areas that were blitzed, where you see here then in red, the dark red, the primary areas of the blitz. These other areas are the breakdown of the zones, which I'll talk about later on. In addition to the Burroughs pointer map, Maxwell also consulted and annotated 1939 Ordnance Survey maps at the scale of 1 to 25, such as the map sheet we see here, the Antrim LX 1.5 map. He found this particular scale of map to be the most useful in identifying the nature of pre-existing buildings, specifically when he was studying the areas in and around the Belfast docks, but also when he was considering the overall fragmentary nature of the destruction that had been caused to the city during the Blitz. I personally find this map fascinating. I love it, not least because of the fact that to me it's quite a personal item now, that we see that Maxwell has actually annotated it himself and added his own extra pieces of drawing and stuff onto it, including his colour code, which I'll give you a bit more information on in a moment. So in order to correlate the utilisation of Blitz sites with the Belfast Corporation and Government post-war city zoning scheme, Maxwell first identified the position and extent of bomb sites across the city. Secondly, he determined the post-war extent of the replacement buildings to have been constructed by 1952. And lastly, by consulting the post-war plans of Belfast by the Corporation and Government, he was able to identify future development and building replacement of Blitz sites. He annotated the details of his findings, adopting specific colours to indicate the primary drop zone across the city, as well as the residential zone stretching from Percy Street in the southwest corner of the city to the Limestone Road in the north, the industrial zone between North Queen Street and York Street, the commercial zone between York Street and Little York Street, and of course the dockside east of Corporation Street. And using the process called georeferencing, I then took the high-resolution archive images of these maps from Maxwell's thesis, which were supplied by our partners at the Northern Ireland War Memorial Museum, and made the maps fit to our modern coordinate system. This allowed me then to trace the areas identified by Norman Maxwell within the GIS, and to later then apply those as interactive layers to our web map. Maxwell also highlighted and colour-coded the Blitz sites, which in 1952 he identified to have been either destroyed and still lay vacant as red, rebuilt as before in yellow, and rebuilt with a different function in blue. I replicated this process and mapped Maxwell's original findings within the GIS project. And that's what you're basically looking at here. So these are the original primary drop zones, commercial, etc. And this is the color coding for the Blitz sites, and the destroyed ones being in red, still lying vacant. The rebuilt as before ones are in yellow, and rebuilt with a different function are highlighted in blue. As we know, the Luftwaffe air raids on Belfast during 1941 resulted in a vast amount of deaths of both civilians and service personnel alike from across our community. So I think it's important that I just highlight a couple of these stories today. One in particular that stood out to me was that of the Wilson family, where 8 members of the same family are known to have died at 56 Edlingham Street during the Easter Tuesday raid, 15th, 16th of April 1941. Robert Wilson, a husband and a father of 5 young children, was the only survivor. His wife Violet was aged 32. His daughter Violet was aged 1. He had twins, Annie and Ellie Wilson. They were aged 7. His son David Wilson was aged 6, and his other son Robert was aged 3. They all died in the same event. Additionally, Violet's mother and brother were also killed. Remarkably, Robert was a survivor of Dunkirk and the Norway campaign of 1940, and was at home in Belfast during the raid, which devastated his whole family. Robert testified at the family inquest into their deaths, stating that he put out incendiaries and was then blown over the banister in the house by a blast. His wife Violet had insisted on being taken from the house to a neighbour's house for safety across the road. So the neighbour took the wife and the children across, while Robert carried his mother-in-law. Elizabeth, the mother-in-law, was blown out of Robert's arms by another blast, and while he was consoling his wife, the building collapsed, burying them all in the rubble. After 3 hours, Robert was dug out alive. The coroner at the inquest told him he was lucky, but of course Robert disagreed. He had no one left, having just lost his entire family, and couldn't see that this was lucky. Unbelievably, his own house, which they had left for safety, was left intact that night, and the coroner stated that it was one of the saddest cases he had heard. Also, and very unfortunately, there is no information relating to the burial of the family, but the fact that their deaths were presumed via inquest implies that their bodies were never recovered or identified, and may well be in one of the mass graves known to exist at Milltown Cemetery or in the city cemetery in Belfast. Another story that I find quite remarkable is that was highlighted by the Belfast Telegraph on Friday, April 25th, 1941. Who is this boy? The story of Billy, the mystery youngster of the Blitz. He was found after the Easter Tuesday raid on a couch in the Mater Hospital, and though he gave his name as Billy, efforts to trace his identity or relatives were initially unsuccessful. He was described in the paper as a bright youngster, perfectly mannered, and a likeable little chap, whose father wore a tin hat and goes on a big ship. As it turned out, Billy was actually called Hugh. Hugh was found in the rubble of 30 varying gardens during the Easter Tuesday raid and brought to the Mater Hospital. His mother May and sisters Sue and Marie were killed when a parachute mine landed near his home. Additionally, his Aunt Jean, Uncle Danny, Cousin Danny were also killed in the blast, effectively his entire family. Hugh's father was in the Navy and was notified of the tragic news by the British Consulate at Norfolk Naval Base, informing him that he was to make his way home immediately. He collected Hugh from his grandmother's house, after which he was then sent to his Aunt Mary's to stay. Shortly after these tragic events, Hugh's father was given compassionate discharge from the Navy. Not surprising, really, when you think of the circumstances. In 2020, the Northern Ireland War Memorial interviewed Hugh as part of their oral history project, and although he was too young to remember the events of Easter Tuesday and his disappearance, he talks about how his father, also known as Hugh, found out about the death of his wife and daughters. And this story and others are available to listen to at the Northern Ireland War Memorial YouTube channel, but will also be linked to our parallel story map. This is Hugh here in 2020, and this is one of the Belfast Telegraph images of Ferrion Gardens, or what was left of Ferrion Gardens after the raid. And of course this here wonderful photograph of Hugh in his father's arms with his mother and his sisters. One I'm sure he has treasured to this day. Our parallel story map incorporates all the web and GIS resources we have accumulated during the project, creating a publicly accessible outreach resource, telling the story of the Belfast Blitz through the casualty accounts and the voices of those who survived. Using the Luftwaffe target map, along with other material drawn from primary historical sources, the platform provides digitally mapped information relating to the Blitz, and by utilising the Northern Ireland War Memorial collections and never before released images for those killed by enemy action in Belfast, Derry, Londonderry, Newtownards and Bangor, the personal stories and individual circumstances of those killed during the Luftwaffe raids can be, for the first time, holistically portrayed. We hope to have the story map launched very soon, but I think Conor can actually fill you in on that better than I could. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed at least my small input, and that you all check out the work and the project once it is released. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, by the way.
Right, so that's the end of the talk, and I'd just like to remind everybody to join the live Q&A, which will be on Zoom in a couple of minutes. So I'll see you there. Thank you.